Okay, let's unpack this. Think about the last time something just, stopped you in your tracks. Maybe it was breathtakingly beautiful, or maybe it even made you recoil a bit.
Hmm.
Was that reaction purely personal, just like a quirk of your own mind, or is there something more universal we can dig into?
That's exactly the territory we're heading into in this deep dive. We're going to try and unravel the threads of, well, aesthetic experience and
Huh.
judgment.
Okay.
What sparks that feeling of pleasure or that jolt of disgust or that sense of awe we sometimes call the sublime?
Yeah.
And what about beauty itself and this often slippery concept of taste?
Right, taste. And to navigate all this, we've got a really interesting mix of voices, actually, from different times, different
We
fields.
do. We'll be drawing on philosophical insights from Ayer on how we perceive the world around us,
Okay.
Taylor on our sort of modern pursuit of authenticity, Confucius connecting virtue and the arts,
Interesting.
Descartes looking at the foundations of thought, and Plato's Republic thinking about justice and order.
And not just philosophy, right? We're also bringing in a socio-political angle.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Fanon on racial identity and social structures, which is crucial here. And then Nietzsche's uh, genealogical look at how our values, including aesthetic ones, have evolved.
That's quite a range. So the goal for us today is...
Well, the goal is to try and synthesize these diverse perspectives,
Right.
to offer you a clearer understanding of aesthetic experience and judgment, how they're defined, what shapes them, how they function.
Mm-hmm.
We want to go deep, but hopefully without getting bogged down in overly academic jargon.
Makes sense. So let's dive right in then. What exactly is this aesthetic experience? It feels like more than just a casual, oh, I like that, or I don't, doesn't it?
It absolutely is, yeah.
Okay.
Aesthetic experience covers a whole range of responses.
Mm.
Pleasure is a key part. Obviously, Plato talks about this, the joys of the intellectual part of the soul.
Okay.
But then there's its opposite, disgust. Nietzsche touches on things that societies find distasteful, even ugly in his terms.
Right.
We also have the sublime, that feeling when something is so vast or powerful, it just inspires awe, maybe echoing what Nietzsche called sublime passion.
Wow.
And beyond those big ones, there's just the immediacy of a spontaneous reaction. And also, sometimes, the deliberate provocation you see in art stuff designed to challenge us.
Quite a spectrum of feelings then. And how do our basic senses, what we see, hear, touch, how do they feed into all of this? I'm thinking of Ayer's idea about sense contents, the sort of raw data.
That's really the bedrock, isn't it? The foundation aesthetic experience is built on. As Ayer pointed out, actually trying to pin down the exact properties of what we perceive is surprisingly difficult.
Oh.
Our sensory experiences, the sights, sounds, textures we encounter, that's the initial input. But how our minds then process and interpret these sense contents, well, that's crucial in determining our aesthetic response.
So like the way light hits a landscape.
Exactly. That's a sense content, and we might interpret that as beautiful, or maybe ominous, depending.
Okay, right. So we have these sensory inputs leading to these initial experiences. But how do we get from that to making an actual aesthetic judgment? Deciding this is beautiful or this isn't.
That's where concepts like beauty and taste really come into play. Now, Hume isn't explicitly in our sources today, but his ideas on taste are just so influential you kind of have to mention them.
Right.
He suggested that while there might be some, maybe, underlying principles of taste that appeal broadly, our individual judgments are also heavily shaped by our personal history, our culture.
Okay.
And you can contrast beauty with, well, ugliness. Nietzsche sometimes linked that idea, especially when criticizing certain moralities, to things society rejects or finds valueless.
And it feels like what we learn, our education, must shape our taste pretty significantly, too. Like someone who studied music theory hears something different in a symphony.
Precisely, yeah. Confucius really emphasized learning the polite arts, music, poetry, ritual. He saw them as integral to cultivating a virtuous character.
So learning refines our senses.
It refines our aesthetic sensibilities, yeah. And similarly, in Plato's Republic, remember, the guardian's education involves carefully choosing stories and music, specifically to instill a love for harmony and order.
Right, the censorship aspect.
Well, yes, the curation, familiarity, learning, the cultural values we soak up, they all contribute to what we end up appreciating aesthetically.
Okay, so where do these aesthetic experiences actually come from? Is it all about the object itself? The painting, the music, or is there more going on with us as the observer?
A stunning natural view can certainly trigger an aesthetic response, sure. Even though our texts don't focus heavily on natural beauty, But the role of the observer is absolutely paramount. You mentioned Gombrich earlier, his idea of the beholder's share.
Yeah.
It's the idea that the viewer actively participates in creating the meaning, the experience of a work of art. Taylor sort of echoes this when he talks about self-discovery involving imagination, like art does.
So it's not passive.
Not at all. Our own thoughts, feelings, memories, they all shape what we see and how we react. You could even think about unseen art, conceptual stuff where the idea is primary. But that's maybe a side note for today.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. It's an active engagement. Okay, so we don't just experience art quietly by ourselves. We use it, we critique it, we talk about it. What are some of the reasons we even make and engage with art beyond just, finding things beautiful?
Oh, art serves so many purposes.
Yeah.
It can be a powerful way to communicate, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
A means of social commentary. A tool for provocation, for challenging norms.
Okay.
Fanon's work is a really compelling example here. He shows how language and images can profoundly impact psychological and social realities, especially around race and colonial power.
So art can reflect society, but also critique it.
And even try to change it, yeah.
And when we encounter art, how do we even start to evaluate it? What makes us say this is powerful, or this is moving, or maybe even this just doesn't work? Are there objective standards? Or is it all just subjective taste?
Ugh, the million-dollar question. It's something thinkers have grappled with for centuries.
Yeah.
We do tend to use certain criteria when we critique art, right? Things like technical skill, originality,
Yeah.
emotional resonance, maybe the depth of the ideas.
Sure.
But whether these criteria are truly objective or if they're ultimately shaped by our own subjective viewpoints and cultural values, well, that's the complex debate.
Mm-hmm.
Nietzsche offers a fascinating lens here, looking at how our values, including aesthetic ones, have actually evolved through history, often tangled up with shifts in power and morality.
It all seems so interconnected then. Our senses kick off emotions, and those emotions feed into what we value aesthetically. Are these links kind of universal, do you think, or do they differ wildly across cultures?
It's probably a mix. Some basic sensory responses, maybe some fundamental emotions, might be pretty much shared across humanity. Fear, pleasure, perhaps.
Okay.
But the meaning we attach to those sensations and emotions and the specific aesthetic values we develop from them, those seem deeply influenced by our cultural context.
Right.
Fanon's analysis, again, of how colonial power dynamics can actually shape aesthetic preferences. What's seen as desirable or beautiful is a really powerful example of this cultural specificity. What one culture elevates, another might find completely uninteresting or even ugly.
That brings up that really crucial issue of cultural bias then. It feels like what gets labeled good taste isn't always just a neutral judgment, is it?
Absolutely not. Our cultural background, our social position, they exert a huge influence on what we perceive as beautiful or valuable. Fanon's concept of the white mask, that internalization of the dominant culture's ideals, it shows how deep these biases can run, affecting aesthetic preferences and even self-worth in colonized communities. But even Confucius's teachings on propriety and ritual show how aesthetic values are embedded within a specific social order.
And Taylor mentioned something about the modern rhetoric of difference.
Yeah, Taylor's point about the rhetoric of difference and diversity in our contemporary culture of authenticity. It suggests that even how we embrace diverse aesthetics happens within a particular cultural framework, with its own assumptions.
It's almost like there's this invisible cultural code dictating what we're supposed to find pleasing. Now, we use the word art all the time, but it covers so much ground. Do we judge, say, a Renaissance masterpiece by the same standards we use for a piece of street art or a pop song?
That's a really sharp point. We do tend to categorize things, don't we? We talk about great works, the ones in museums with all the historical weight. Then there are everyday artifacts, skilled crafts, mass-produced pop art, reproductions. And then different art forms, literature, music, visual arts with their own branches like painting, sculpture, and so on.
Right.
Now, our sources today don't explicitly spell out different criteria for judging each category, but it feels highly likely that we do implicitly apply different frameworks.
Like you wouldn't judge a handmade pot the same way you judge a blockbuster movie.
Exactly. The criteria for assessing skill in that pot might be very different from how we evaluate the cultural impact or narrative structure of the film.
Okay. Finally, let's just touch on some of the specific philosophical takes on art and aesthetics from our source list. Plato, in the Republic, he had some pretty strong ideas about art's role in his ideal society.
He certainly did. Plato was really concerned about the influence of art, especially poetry and music, on the character of the citizens, particularly the guardians who were meant to protect the state.
He worried it could corrupt them.
Essentially, yes. He believes certain types of art, especially stories showing gods or heroes behaving badly, or music that stirred up the wrong kinds of emotions, could be harmful to individuals and destabilize the state.
So he advocated for censorship.
A degree of it, yes. Or at least careful selection, to ensure art served a moral and educational purpose, promoting virtue, harmony, order.
And then we have Nietzsche, who often seems to come from a completely different angle. What's his perspective, particularly on the genealogy of morals?
Yeah, Nietzsche offers quite a contrast. Instead of focusing on art's moral function like Plato, he digs into the history of our values. He argues that our aesthetic preferences are often deeply intertwined with power dynamics and moral judgments that have developed over time.
Okay.
He looks at things like the ascetic ideal, that lifestyle of self-denial, and how it shows up in culture, including art. For Nietzsche, aesthetic judgments aren't necessarily about some pure inherent quality of beauty.
What are they about then?
They might reflect underlying drives, power struggles, historical forces, even in some cases a kind of life-denying impulse. It's much more critical and historical.
Fascinating. And Taylor brings in this very modern focus on authenticity. How does that connect to art and how we judge it today?
Taylor really emphasizes how originality and the act of creation itself, what he calls poiesis, bringing something genuinely new into the world, is central to our contemporary ideal of authenticity.
So we value artists who are original.
We often do, yes. Artists who express a unique vision, who break from tradition. For Taylor, art becomes this crucial way for individuals to express themselves, to define who they are against the backdrop of society. So the artist's unique voice becomes a really key factor in our aesthetic appreciation.
Wow. This has been a really illuminating exploration. So if we were to try and pull out some key takeaways from this deep dive on aesthetic experience and judgment, what would you say they are?
Yep. I think a few core ideas really stand out.
Mm-hmm.
First, that aesthetic experience is incredibly multifaceted. It's way more than just liking or disliking something beautiful. It includes disgust, awe, provocation.
Right.
Second, our individual perceptions, our gut reactions, are constantly interacting with these powerful cultural forces that shape our tastes and our judgments, often without us realizing it.
Okay, that makes sense.
And finally, aesthetic values aren't set in stone. They evolve historically, and they're often deeply connected to broader social, moral, and even political forces, as thinkers like Nietzsche and Fanon really highlight.
Absolutely. You know, considering all these different angles we've looked at, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How does this shift your own appreciation of beauty or art? And maybe more pointedly, what unseen cultural filters, what biases might be subtly influencing your aesthetic preferences right now without you even being aware of them? It's definitely something to keep thinking about.
Indeed it is. And if this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, we really encourage you to reflect on these ideas as you go about your life, and maybe even dig into some of the rich source material we touched on today.
There's always more to discover.
Always more in the intricate world of aesthetics.